Hello and welcome to this third class lecture, if you like, about grammatical topics from the Market Leader course book. So in the previous two lectures, we discussed idioms, noun compounds and noun phrases, multi-word verbs, and of course in the previous class as well, verb tenses. Well, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, verb tenses are usually considered very difficult by Dutch learners of English. And the primary reason for that is that in English, we are much more strict about when to use which verb tenses. So in the previous lecture, I indicated or I helped you out by giving you a few tricks or teaching you a few tricks on how to spot keywords, clues, which will guide you in getting to the right verb tense, in figuring out which verb tense you need. Well, today's subject, the passive voice, which is the grammatical subject as part of Unit 5, we need to build on your knowledge or your new knowledge of verb tenses. So the table of contents for today is as follows. We'll first discuss what the passive voice is, and we'll look at how we distinguish between active and passive sentences. We'll talk about the use, so why would we use the passive voice in the first place? And how can you make active sentences passive? Well, for that, we'll take a three-step approach, which I'll explain later on. So when I ask students, what is the passive voice? They usually have no idea. If I then say, well, in Dutch we call it the leidende vorm, they still have blank views, blank looks on their faces. And then very often I ask, well, what does it mean to be passive? And usually somebody says, it's not being active. That may seem very straightforward description of passive. It means that the person or someone who is passive doesn't do something actively, but something happens to that person. Just waits and sees, basically. So to make this more clear, I have two sentences for you on this slide. The first one is the secretary will send the agenda tomorrow. And the second one is the agenda will be sent tomorrow by the secretary. So you have to ask yourself first, do these sentences say the same thing or do they say something different? So take a close look. The same or something different? Well, now that I've given you a few seconds to think about it, hopefully you've said the same. Why is that? Well, because the process is the same. It's still the same person doing the sending. Emphasis of the sentence is different. So let's take a look at the first sentence. The secretary will send the agenda tomorrow. Is this an active or a passive sentence? It's active because for that we have to look at the subject of the sentence. The subject, het onderwerp, is the secretary. And she or he, most likely she, will send something tomorrow. She will take action. She'll have to actually send the email. Whereas in the second example, the subject is the agenda, and the agenda doesn't do anything, but something happens to it. It will be sent tomorrow by the secretary, but in this sentence that is not so important because it focuses on the process rather than on who does it. So a few examples, once more, to explain the difference between active and passive sentences. Is the dog bit the man? The second one is the man was bitten. The first sentence, sentence A, is active because the dog actively put its teeth in the man's arm, legs, butt, wherever. Whereas in the second sentence, something happens to the subject, to the man. And you see that the dog's been left out by the dog. Because in the second sentence, it's not so important who did it, whether that was a dog or a snake or a cat. But the most important thing is that this man has been hurt and he needs to be taken to a hospital or to the doctor. Second example, these shirts are produced in Cambodia. This is a passive sentence. As you can see, these shirts cannot do something by themselves, but something happens to them, namely that they are produced in Cambodia. The B example, the company produces these shirts in Cambodia, is the active sentence because you see in sentence A that the company or by the company has been left out. Once again, for the same reason as example 1. It's about the process and not so much about who does that. Third and final example for now is since 2009, we have worked with these sales reps, sales representatives. Sentence B is these sales reps have been worked with since 2009. Sentence A is the active sentence. Sentence B is the passive sentence. We in A is the subject. We actively have been doing that from then till now, present perfect, something we discussed in the previous class. And then in B, they have been worked with, some refers back to the subject, the sales reps. They didn't do anything themselves, but the collaboration was instigated by us, by we. So the by us, that's not important. So here you see, once again, it's all about the subject of the sentence. If you need to filter out or need to determine whether the sentence is active or passive. So why do we use the passive voice? Well, let's go back to the first example I used about the secretary and the agenda. As I mentioned already, is in a passive sentence, sentence B, it's all about the process rather than the actor. Well, this is very important in business communication because it makes the communication less direct, less blunt, and less a blame game. Dutch people are known to be very direct, whereas in especially British culture, people are known to be very indirect. So if a British person says, for instance, that's very interesting, that may actually mean that they're not interested at all. And so it's more about reading between the lines, whereas Dutch people are very blunt and say, this is the way it is. So passives are a very important tool to de-emphasize who does it and to de-person a message in order to make it more polite. So a very clear example is the one you see at the bottom of the slide. You made a mistake. Very direct, finger pointing. You made the mistake. However, in business communication, you never know, and in real life, whether the person you talk to on the phone or the person you email or send a letter to, even though that's more old-fashioned these days, is in fact the person who made the mistake. You don't know where things went wrong. And since you may rely on these suppliers and you want them to fix the problem, it's better to avoid the blame game and focus on the process rather than on who did it, even because in this case you don't even know. So instead, it would be better to say we unpacked the box and found out that a mistake was made. So here you see that you don't care about who did it, but you found out that you did not get what you ordered, for instance. In that way, you'll be more friendly and polite towards the other party, and they will be more inclined, more likely to assist you. And it won't damage your business relationship. So then a very important task or step is, how do you change the active sentence to a passive one? Well, you've seen a few examples and maybe you filtered out the rules already. And so how can you go through the process of metamorphosis from active to passive? Well, for that you need to take 3 steps. The first step is that you need a new subject as you move from active to passive. And it's actually quite straightforward. The direct object of the active sentence het leidend voorwerp, as we say in Dutch, becomes the subject of active, or passive rather. Second step is you need to determine the verb tense of active. Is it present? Is it past? Is it future? And for this, you need to rely on what we discussed. When do we use which verb tense? And the third and final step is that you need to know that a voice or a passive sentence always consists, as far as its form is concerned, and what it looks like, of a form of the verb to be plus the past participle, het voltooid deelwoord. So a form of to be that depends on the verb tense of the active sentence, whether it's present, past, or future, or present perfect for that matter, and the past participle, het voltooid deelwoord. Regular verbs, as you know from last week, or from the previous session, plus ed, and irregular verbs, the third row of that list with irregular verbs that you may remember from secondary school. Rise, rose, risen. Became, become, became, become. Strike, struck, struck. So the third one you need for the past participle voltooid deelwoord form. A few sample sentences. Take a look at these three. Again, as you go through these, you need to have a new subject as you move from active to passive. These three sentences are all active, so you have to make them passive. So in sentence one, you need a new subject. So direct object of active becomes the subject of passive. Then you look at the verb tense of active. In the first sentence, that's pays, present simple, regular present tense. And then you need to insert a form of to be plus the past participle. The second sentence, we see a new subject, or we need a new subject. In this case, the direct object of active. What is the direct object of active? Which or what was offered or has been offered? Well, works, your new subject. We see have offered in active. Have offered, present perfect, needs to come back in passive as well. The third sentence, a research center is investigating profitability. What is our new subject? Look at the verb tense of active. Is investigating, present continuous. Present continuous in active is present continuous in passive. So with this in mind, you can stop the presentation here just to do this exercise and get back to it. I'd now like to move to the answers. First sentence, direct object becomes subject. Your salary is paid on Fridays. By the company can be left out, or you can put it between brackets as is done in the example. Is paid because we see pays present simple in the active sentence. So we need a present form of to be, is or are. Our subject is singular, one salary. So we need is plus the past participle voltooid deelwoord form of to pay. To pay is an irregular verb, as you can see. So pay, second sentence. We already determined should be our new subject. Present perfect in active, have offered, should come back in passive, so we need to insert that form of to be. Have been offered. To offer is a regular verb, so you see that it once again gets an ed ending. The third sentence is the most tricky because we have ing, present continuous, in active. That also means that the ing needs to come back in some form in passive. So we have a new subject, staff engagement and corporate profitability. And then how do we make sure that the ing form of active comes back in passive? Well, by adding the ing together or gluing it to be. So you see, is being investigated. We don't care that it was done by the research center, but if you like, you can put between brackets or just put it in for the understanding of the sentence. Two more examples, two final examples. The hotel's new spa facilities generated increased revenues. And 5, cultural differences might cause misunderstandings between team members. Based on the 3 previous sentences, go through the same process. If you would like to try this for yourself, please stop the recording here and then replay it, because then I'll move to the answers. So now I'd like to move to the answers. How can you turn these sentences passive? Once again, you take the step of making the direct object of active the subject of the passive sentence. So increased revenues. We look at the verb tense of active, generated, past tense. So again, we need to insert step 3, a form of to be plus the past participle, that voltooid deelwoord, were generated. And were. The subject is plural, meervoud, so we need were, and to generate is a regular verb, so it can go with an ed ending. Then 5, misunderstandings between team members is our new subject, as it was the direct object of the active sentence. Then we need might cause. That follows the same structure as will and can and should. So where do we put the be? Well, after cause, or might in this case. Might be plus the past participle at voltooid deelwoord caused by cultural differences. So these are the steps you need to take in moving from active to passive. So I can imagine that 5 examples may not be enough and you need some extra practice. Well, for that, you can turn to exercise C on page 48 of the course book, and you can turn to the exercise, the passive voice exercise, which has been made available to you on Blackboard. So these are 10 sentences following the format, and maybe while listening to this lecture once again, and then after you've completed the 10 sentences in a separate file, you can find the answers and try to determine where you went wrong or whether you were successful. If you feel that after this lecture and after the additional exercises, you still have trouble doing this, please let me know and I can discuss this further during a regular Q&A session. So hopefully this has provided you with additional information and additional help, and will make you successful in carrying out these exercises. So I look forward to seeing you in a next lecture. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to seeing you again.